And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight's conversation. William Brennan is a freelance journalist and the winner of a 2020 National City and Regional Magazine Award for feature writing. His work appears in The Atlantic, the New York Times Magazine, New York, and other outlets. In 2016, he fact-checked Ariel Sabar's Atlantic article, The Unbelievable Tale of Jesus' Wife, upon which Veritas is based. And now for our featured author tonight. Ariel Sabar is an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in The Atlantic, the New York Times, Harper's Magazine, the Washington Post, and many other publications. He is the author of My Father's Paradise, A Son's Search for His Jewish Past in Kurdish Iraq, which won the National Book Critique Circle Award. They're here today to discuss this book. See that? Veritas, a Harvard professor, a con man, and the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. Please welcome Ariel Sabar and William Brennan.
Thanks to Charlie for the introduction. Hi, everyone who's joined, and hi to you, Ariel. It's good to see you. And it's good to be here tonight. I mean, I've been really looking forward to this because I feel like everything about this story around this book, in the book itself, is like absolutely incredible. And I'm excited to be talking about it and to, helping other people kind of learn about it, and hopefully they'll pick up the book and see what's so great about it. And I guess to start off, Charlie mentioned it in the introduction, but you and I go back, I guess, about, 5 years now, to 2016. When we first met was when I fact-checked the article that Veritas is based on in The Atlantic, The Unbelievable Tale of Jesus' Wife. I actually dug up an artifact, since we're talking about ancient artifacts, which is my galley from checking that, which I hold on to just because it was such an incredible experience to get to work on that. But actually, your connection, Ariel, to the Gospel of Jesus' Wife goes back even before that. And I kind of wanted to start there. So that, could you take us back to kind of how you first heard about the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, what your first connection to it was, and when that was?
Sure. Thanks so much, DeChali and Village Books, for hosting this. Really appreciate it, and thank you, Billy, for agreeing to be my interviewer tonight. Really an honor, and I appreciate you taking the time to do it. Yeah, you're right. So I was a relatively new freelancer for Smithsonian Magazine. This is the magazine affiliated with the Smithsonian institutions here in Washington, D.C. And I had filed one story for them on something, I think it was like pogo sticks or something like really silly, like adult pogo sticks. And so I was really nervous because I wanted to write for Smithsonian Magazine, and I'm not sure, I don't think that story had been published quite yet. And so I get a call out of the blue one day from one of the top editors at the magazine, and someone I had not heard from, and he said, and I, of course, feared that, oh my gosh, I must have done something really terrible with this other story. They never want to work with me again. But it was really completely, could be more just bizarre. It was, we have the story that's sort of fallen into our lap. We have gotten sort of a scoop. There's a Harvard professor, very distinguished at the Harvard Divinity School, who has uncovered a piece of papyrus that contains this sort of history-making phrase. And in the middle of the papyrus, in the ancient Egyptian language of Coptic, is this phrase, Jesus said to them, my wife. And this papyrus appeared to date, possibly as early as the 2nd century AD. And it would be, if authentic, the first ancient manuscript in which Jesus speaks of having a wife. So clearly, epic making, if authentic. And Smithsonian is very, and I'm sort of like, this is crazy. I mean, I don't. First of all, I'm not really a religion reporter. I'm Jewish. I hadn't really spent a lot of time around the New Testament, and I knew that I have to there'd be a sort of steep learning curve. And I'm a quick study. I was a daily journalist for a decade. I can get ramped up pretty quickly on a new subject. But I knew this would be a challenging story, but also a really exciting one. I mean, a Harvard professor uncovering sort of a history-making fragment manuscript that had never been seen before. And the editor said, we don't have a lot of time to turn this around. She's going to announce this discovery in Rome in 3 weeks. How would you like to get on a plane to Harvard to see the manuscript, to interview the professor, Dr. Karen King, and then fly to Rome to be in the room essentially when she announces this discovery at a scholarly conference across the street from the Vatican? I mean, so it was a sort of terrifying assignment, but one that I felt like it was too good to pass up, because wherever the story led, I thought it would just be absolutely fascinating. So that was my first. That was how I got the assignment.
Yeah. What was it that they like? You had published this piece about pogo sticks. What was it that they told you? They were coming to you with this Gospel of Jesus' wife.
So I think that's a good guess. I mean, that's a good question, and I can only guess at it. I mean, I think I did actually turn in. They knew that I had written a story about my father's immigrant journey from the mountains from an ancient Jewish community that spoke the Aramaic, the 3,000-year-old language of Jesus. I had written a book that had done fairly well called My Father's Paradise, that did sort of explore this ancient language that my father is actually a native speaker of, that Jesus was also a speaker of. And I had sort of explored the sort of intersection between the ancient world and the modern one. And I think I'd even submitted or pitched or maybe written a first draft of for Smithsonian another story that looked at academics, scholars, sort of in the generation below my father, who were knocking on doors across the world to capture the last surviving speakers of Aramaic. So Aramaic, this 3,000-year-old language of Jesus, was in this last generation of speakers. And I did sort of, I guess I had, the how to engineer a pogo stick that can send an adult 8 feet in the air was a fun story to write. They were aware of other stories I had done and my book, which dealt with kind of these intersections between the ancient world and the modern one. So I think that inspired some of their interest in having me cover it. Plus, I think they also knew that I was a newspaper reporter, and that 3 weeks isn't a whole lot of time for someone who's only done magazine writing to get their head around a story this complex that quickly.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I mean, the Atlantic piece, correct me if I'm wrong, but you worked on that for, I think 5 or 6 months at least.
That's right. Yeah. Right.
And so to only have 3 weeks to turn around a piece that's kind of, I guess that Smithsonian must have known that there would be some controversy around this. Obviously, it's a headline-grabbing story. How did you choose where to start with those 3 weeks? I mean, did you go to? Maybe you could tell us about Karen King, who she is, and
sure.
Kind of.
Yeah. So Dr. King, is the Hollis Professor of Divinity at Harvard. It's the oldest endowed professorship in any subject in all of North America. And she grew up in Montana cow country. It's sort of tough. Grew up sort of tough as a bit of an outsider. She was picked on as a kid. She's a believer. She actually left her family's Methodist church to walk across the street to the Episcopal church, which she thought was more intellectually serious. And in college, she became really interested in the study of these texts that did not make, these early Christian texts that did not make the cut into the New Testament. So if the New Testament is the Bible you read in church, so the authorized, sanctioned, curated group of official sort of sacred writings of Christianity, there were a lot of other texts that were circulating in the first centuries of Christianity that did not make it into the New Testament, mostly because they were banished or banned or excluded by bishops who tarred them as heretical. And so Karen King sort of made her name as a scholar by sort of brilliant interpretations of these so-called heretical texts, many of which sometimes are known as Gnostic texts, heretical texts, whatever your terminology will be, non-canonical texts. And a lot of them are interesting because they tell they're stories about the meaning of Jesus's life and teachings, but they feature many of the same characters. You have the Virgin Mary, you have Mary Magdalene, you have the apostles, but those characters play somewhat different roles. And I think one of the most striking things for Karen King and for a lot of other scholars is that female figures are much more prominent and much more powerful in these texts that didn't make the New Testament. chief among them Mary Magdalene, who centuries of Western tradition has slandered as a repentant prostitute. There's actually nothing in any sacred text, canonical or non-canonical, that portrays her as a prostitute. In fact, if anything, she's portrayed as a very close disciple of Jesus, the first witness to the resurrection in the Gospel of John, for instance. But these other texts, like the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, portray her in even a still more central role in Jesus's life. And so she became this sort of brilliant interpreter of these excluded texts. And so for me, I guess in those first 3 weeks, I had to do a lot of reading just to understand sort of what, how the sort of false image of Mary Magdalene as a repentant prostitute became so prominent, but then what scholars had taken away from these excluded texts that portrayed Mary Magdalene in a different light. And then finally, what scholarship told us about this debate about whether Jesus was in fact married. And the fascinating thing about the New Testament, although in the popular imagination and theology, and sort of Orthodox theology, Jesus is portrayed as a lifelong celibate bachelor, there's nothing actually in the New Testament that says whether that Jesus was married or that he wasn't married. The figure of the married Jesus only appears in the 2nd century, and in the writings of theologians. And so it's a matter of sort of interpretation, and there's strong arguments on both sides. And so there's this silence into which one can imagine whether Jesus was married or not. And of course, probably the most famous person to have stepped into that imaginative space is Dan Brown with the Da Vinci Code, and which becomes relevant in the book later on. Not to give away too many spoilers, but I think it is this sort of silence that people of various stripes have sort of filled, whether Jesus was married or not, because whether he was married or not has all sorts of implications for the sexuality, for the celibate all-male priesthood, and other questions about the role of women in the church.
And so Karen King sort of was very well situated to be the person who would publicize this fragment that had turned up out of who knows where. I mean, we'll talk in a second about where it came from, who brought it to her. But I wonder if you could tell us about what happened in Rome, because you had spoken to Karen King, I think, before going abroad. Yes. And then the magazine sent you to go actually attend her presentation, like you said, across from the Vatican, very cinematic kind of juxtaposition there. And could you bring us to that moment? I think you were the only reporter who was actually there. So you were kind of the outsider amongst these scholars. What happened? What did King say? And what was the response? Yeah, so it was really interesting. It was weird going into you walk into a room where you kind of know a bomb is going to go off and no one else does. And so I had interviewed her beforehand. She had also given interviews to 2 other journalists, a reporter for the New York Times and a journalist for the Boston Globe. They did not come to Rome. I mean, they sort of did their interviews. We all were prohibited from publishing until she actually made the official announcement, but she wanted to kind of bring reporters up to speed before she officially announced. So I kind of knew going into that room of scholars what she was going to say. But what I didn't know was what the reaction would be. And it was really kind of striking because it was a room full of the top scholars in the world in texts, early Christian texts written in Coptic, which is the language of Egypt's earliest Christians. And right away, there was a lot of skepticism about this discovery. And the interesting thing was that at that point, those scholars did not even have the advantage of seeing images of the papyrus. It was actually quite disturbing to a lot of the scholars that Karen King would announce this discovery, and not only without the papyrus itself being present, but without even offering images of it at its announcement. And so scholars of these ancient texts really need to see the papyrus. They need to see what the ink looks like. They need to see what the handwriting looks like, what the papyrus itself looks like, because all these visual cues tell you something about the question of authenticity. But Karen King was very eager to sort of shove aside questions of authenticity, even though she had some papyrologists look at it before she came to Rome. She was really interested in going straight to what the text said and what it might mean for the history of Christianity. She wanted to sort of if people were going to ask questions about authenticity, she didn't want those questions being asked at the announcement. She wanted to focus on the interpretation of the text, which was always where her genius lay, was making sense of these very fragmentary texts. I don't know how well this will translate, but here's a much enlarged image of the papyrus itself. It's actually just the size of a business card.
is blown up to many times its size here, but you can see it's missing all of its margin. So you have 8 lines of Coptic. You don't know what the text says before and after each of those lines. And so it's very, very much sort of a puzzle, and played very much to Karen King's strong suit as a sort of solver of mysteries. But scholars were very concerned, even from the translation itself, that something was amiss about this. And they were also they also were wondering why she called it a gospel. A gospel has a very particular meaning in Christian tradition. It's a story about about the life of Jesus, of the earthly Jesus. And there was no way to tell from a fragment this small whether this was actually a gospel or was kind of a post-resurrection revelation. And so, like, Karen King had given this tiny scrap a headline that would, had given it a headline essentially. It wasn't like the Mary fragment or fragment 225 AB. It was the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, which is a title that was basically almost made for the front page headline that it would receive in the New York Times the next day.
And if I recall right, her talk itself had a very overlookable title, right? I don't know exactly what it was, but as far as her talk at that conference, it said a new Coptic fragment or something.
A new Coptic fragment, something very, very banal. So you have these 2 tracks where on the one hand, when she was presenting it to scholars, probably not to give them any sort of spoilers before she announced it, had this very banal sort of academic title. But even before she came, she had provided journalists access to photos of and the fragment itself, and given them this really soundbite worthy title that a lot of her own colleagues, including her friend and co-author Elaine Pagels, author of the most famous book on the Gnostic Gospel, National Book Award winning The Gnostic Gospels, 1979 book that introduced these Gospels to the public. Elaine Pagels told me, I don't understand how she came up with that title. I can't think of any scholarly justification for it. And so right away, there was a lot of pushback from her own colleagues. Something seemed off, and something seemed uncharacteristic, because Karen King had a kind of sterling reputation. It didn't seem like her to do something like this. And that's what made it, that's where I sort of left when I filed the Smithsonian piece. I certainly had a lot of caveats in it that we don't know. There's a lot of questions about authenticity, but I kind of filed that piece and then moved on to other freelance assignments for other magazines. Didn't really think about the story again for 3 years.
Yeah. So what was it? What was it a few years later when you kind of turned back to this? A lot of journalists just file their, that big project is done, put it away in the file drawer, but you came back to it 3 years later. What was it? Yeah,
it was one of those stories that really kind of sank its hooks into me. I think there was a mystery surrounding it. There were still, I remember I was so interested in how this story would play out that I set a Google alert so that every time there was somewhere on the web or a news story with some small incremental development in what scholars were finding or saying about the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, those would pop into my inbox. And I remember 3 years later, scholars were still having this really robust debate over authenticity, but there was this one kind of important question. I think a lot of scholars thought so too, that had never been answered, which was the question of, where did this papyrus come from? Who was this anonymous collector who approached Karen King and said, here, I have this papyrus. Will you tell me what it means? And I asked Karen King, like a lot of reporters did, like a lot of scholars did, in 2012 when she made the announcement, who is this person? And she said, I can't tell you. The man requested anonymity. I'm sorry. I've had to honor that request. I cannot tell you who this man is. And I do remember asking her, even then, I pressed, I sort of begged, I did whatever because I think, this question of provenance is really important when you have a sort of an earth-shattering manuscript that emerges out of the ether. It's important to know, it's important to go beyond just vetting the manuscript itself for signs of authenticity. You really have to know who your source is. This is sort of a basic tenet of journalism, know your sources. It also presumably is a basic tenet of history, and Karen King is a historian. So I did ask her, okay, so you can't tell me who this guy is. Is he a well-known collector? Is he somebody whose name, were it to be publicized, people in the know in the art world or in the sort of Bible collecting world would go, oh, that guy. And she said, no, he was a complete stranger. He just emailed me out of the blue, said he had this fragment, he didn't know what it meant. He thought it might involve a dialogue between Jesus and the disciples over Mary Magdalene, but beyond that, he was completely clueless. And so it was this burning question that no one had been able to answer, that I felt like might help us scholars understand whether this fragment might be authentic or not. Would lay in who this individual was. And so I pitched the Atlantic magazine. I said, I have some clues. I've sort of done some investigative reporting. I don't know who this individual is. I've made a little bit of progress on my own. I've sort of narrowed it down. Is there any way you'd be willing to take on a story like this whose ending we don't know yet? And thank God I worked for just an absolutely brilliant editor who Billy worked for as well, named Denise Wills at the Atlantic, who said, you know what? Yeah, it's going to be a great detective story no matter what you discover. If you don't discover much, it might be a short story, but if you discover something big, then it might be a bigger story. And I'm still super grateful to Denise for taking a chance on, a story where we just didn't really know, a mystery that had not been solved, but that might be, might be really interesting. And I remain grateful to this day for her willingness to say, go for it, even though we didn't know what the investigation would turn out.
And if I remember, so the first thing you did was you went down to Florida. Can you talk a little bit about who was in Florida and what kind of put you on the case of that person?
Yeah, so one of the things I had actually managed to convince Karen King to do in 2012, though she would not reveal the man's identity, I really wanted to be able to describe in my Smithsonian piece this sort of dance between anonymous collector and world-renowned scholar. How is it that someone nobody's ever heard of is manages to convince someone as savvy as Karen King to take on and publicize a manuscript like this? And so after asking multiple times, she did agree to share with me their email exchanges, like from the beginning, from the time he approached her to the time almost before she announced. And she did, it wasn't the actual emails themselves. She stripped out all the identifying details, no email addresses, no names, no identifying details, but she cut and paste the text from the emails, put the dates of the exchanges on them. And so one of the things she did there was and what she did announce publicly is that the owner before the current owner is a dead man named Hans Ulrich Laukamp. This guy, she didn't know much about him, but the guy who gave it to her claimed to have bought it from this other man named Hans Ulrich Laukamp. Now you can tell just from the sound of the name, it's a pretty unusual name. And I was like, well, maybe if we start with figuring out who this Hans Ulrich Laukamp is, we might be able to figure out who the current owner is, because maybe this guy, maybe we can find out who he is, who his relatives were, who his friends were. And so I did basically a simple search of kind of proprietary, like a whitepages.com database. And even though he was described as German, well, he's described as German American by Karen King. She didn't really know much about him. She didn't reach out to any of his relatives. She didn't know anything other than the name, and that he was German American. And so only one Hans Ulrich Laukamp shows up anywhere in America, and he shows up in this seaside Gulf Coast Florida community, Venice, Florida, lots of retirees, and he had built like a house there with a swimming pool in this sort of modest neighborhood, not on the water. And I just figured, like, if and he hadn't lived there for very long. He seemed like his actual address was in Berlin, but he and his wife had built this house there and then sold it after a few years. And then I had also found some death certificates in the Sarasota County clerk's office. So he'd like passed away. It was weird. I just like figured if the papyrus was purchased in this period that the current owner said it was, then it was very likely purchased in the United States and probably in Florida. And so looking at Florida public records, I established sort of a group of people close to Hans Ulrich Laukamp. And it had been two people who had been in business with him. One of those people had moved back to Germany, but there was a third man, a man named Walter Fritz, who still lived pretty much in the same area. And that the Walter Fritz wound up being this absolutely fascinating character who would lead me down, 100 rabbit holes before we figured out who he was and what his past looked like.
Yeah, and so, I mean, what were the when you started working on the Atlantic story, what were the kind of breakthrough moments that come to mind? I mean, getting in touch with Fritz, obviously, but where did it go from there that you started to piece things together more and more to kind of figure out where
one of the first clues was when I started, it seems so silly, like investigative journalist, right? It sounds sort of glamorous, but actually, one of the first things a lot of us do before we start doing a ton of knocking on doors and cold calling is we do Google searches. It's sort of embarrassing to admit, but I started doing Google searches on Walter Fritz and Egypt and Coptic, because I thought, is there any Walter Fritz that might be associated with Egypt or Coptic? And the trouble is that Walter Fritz is an extremely common name, especially in Germany. And there's a famous German soccer player named Fritz Walter, and Google searches sometimes confuse the two. There's also Walter Fritz Mondale. Like there was a ton of noise in the search results. But I remember very far, I think relatively far down in the search pages, there was a Walter Fritz who had written an article for a very prestigious German language Egyptology journal in the early 90s, in which this Walter Fritz had deciphered an ancient Egyptian text, and he published on it. And I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting. Like, this guy who was a business partner of Hans-Ulrich von Kamp in Florida has the same name as a guy who wrote an article 2 decades earlier deciphering an Egyptian text. So my first move was like, oh, I need to contact the editors of this journal, former editors, that moved on 2 decades, figure out who this Walter Fritz was who would contribute this article. And the strangest thing happened when I emailed both of the editors, very prominent Egyptologists. They said, I don't remember. This guy wrote an article. I can see his name in the table of contents, but I have no recollection of who he was. He's certainly not active anymore. And the strange thing was that the article itself had been quoted by prominent scholars in various studies of this ancient Amarna tablet. So the article itself had been taken quite seriously by the scholarly community, but no one knew who this Walter Fritz was or what had happened to him. In fact, when I tracked down, eventually someone said, yeah, there was a guy by that name here who was a master's student in the early 90s, but he never graduated. He just vanished off campus one day. And is he dead? One of his former classmates said he must be dead. I've never heard of him since he vanished from campus. And so to me, that was one of the big breakthroughs. If there was a Walter Fritz, same name, studied at this university, apparently had studied Coptic. I'd also learned that he wasn't very good at Coptic, which was interesting because one of the problems with the Gospel of Jesus' wife is that the Coptic is bad. There's no fewer than 4 grammatical errors. There are typos, but spelling errors, grammatical errors in a very small fragment. And so that made me very curious to see whether these 2 Walter Fritzes were possibly the same person.
And you mentioned that the Coptic was kind of notably bad on the fragment. Just as a detour from the story, there was a group of kind of scholar bloggers who had stayed on the case for a while. What, beyond those scholars in Rome who had criticized or raised questions about the fragment, what was kind of being said in those in-between years about it? And did anything add to the credibility of the papyrus, or were they just digging up more and more issues?
Right, no, that's a really great question. So Karen King, amid the uproar in Rome, just sort of went underground for about 1.5 years. We didn't hear anything more about it. She said she was going to do these scientific tests. The tests were supposed to happen a few months later. They were never announced. More and more months passed. A lot of people thought she was quietly walking away from this thing after realizing she had sort of announced it before she had done all of her homework on vetting it. And then, a 1.5 years later, Harvard Theological Review, which is run by the Harvard Divinity School, edited by the Harvard Divinity School, finally published her article, which they had tabled amid the uproar. They finally published it along with scientific studies by scientists at MIT and Columbia and those studies seemed to find no evidence of modern forgery. And this was covered in the Boston Globe and the New York Times. Scientific tests find no proof of forgery, and it seemed to be this sort of really vindicating moment for Karen King. She had these scholars from very prominent scientists from very prominent universities who would come along and sort of seem to authenticate the papyrus, and so there was another round of sort of adulation, or sort of this pioneering scholar who had defied the critics and had been proven right by science. And it was interesting because in one of the, so all along, however, there were these sort of independent scholars. I mean, they weren't quite like people sounding off on Reddit exactly, but there were people who had gotten PhDs or master's degrees from prominent universities, but never got positions at those universities, who are actually finding some of the most interesting evidence of forgery, including evidence that the Gospel of Jesus and Wife was actually a very clever cut and paste of phrases from an eccentric online PDF translation of the Gospel of Thomas, which is another non-canonical gospel, 114 sayings of Jesus. The interesting thing is that this PDF interlinear translation, which interspersed Coptic lines of the Gospel of Thomas with English lines of the Gospel of Thomas, there were errors in the Coptic. The person who did the translation was not a Coptic specialist. He was sort of a bit of a conspiracy theorist. And he made some errors when he transcribed the ancient Coptic to Microsoft Word. And the Gospel of Jesus' Wife contains the same typographical errors as this online 2002 PDF, which was a pretty damning find. So you had these people working in their basements in places like Portland, Oregon, got a really smart scholar, independent scholar named Andrew Bernhard, finding these other clues that were really, it's like the science sort of like was interesting, but it wasn't really adding up. And of course, later I would discover in the book, will point out that these scientists who were recruited had unbelievable conflicts of interest. Like one of them was a family friend of a scholar who, one of the only major scholars who also believed it was authentic, never disclosed to the public, complete failure to disclose a sharp conflict of interest, even to the journal. Another was a close family friend of Karen King's from childhood. That relationship was never disclosed. Neither of the scientists had ever before conducted any kinds of tests on antiquities. All these things were never disclosed. These things were I discovered in the course of my investigative reporting. So you have these kind of like independent scholars really, using this is sort of the democratization of scholarship in a way, because of the internet, because of these blogs. You don't have necessarily, for better or for worse. I mean, it's good for things to be peer reviewed, and they should be. But when you're able to, as a scholar, to post something on a blog and have like kind of a really robust online conversation about whether you've made a successful argument about whether something's authentic in real time, that wound up being actually more dispositive in some ways than the very slow-moving process of peer-reviewed journals. And so you had actually some of the bigger findings, which were eventually confirmed by very big scholars. The initial findings were made by these independent scholars really working in their basements, not affiliated with universities. So it's really a story of kind of also underdog scholars taking on, the richest and most powerful university in the world.
Right. So there was almost like two stories out at the same time. The one that you would see kind of circa, I guess, 2014, 2015 of this has been authenticated. And then the one going on online of, there's a lot of questions still to be answered about this. You kind of had to travel the world to track down the story of the provenance of the fragment. Can you talk about going to Germany and what was going on there?
Yeah, so I wanted to, Walter Fritz at first lied to me about whether he was the same Walter Fritz who studied Egyptology for a few years in Berlin. He's a German. He said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not the owner of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. I never studied Egyptology in Berlin. I don't know what you're talking about. So I went to Germany and, with a picture of Walter Fritz that I got from his local paper in Florida and showed it to people at the university. And they said, yep, that looks about 2 decades older, but that looks like the same guy. So right away, I sort of learned that Walter Fritz lied to me about who he was. I also went to speak to the relatives of Hans Ulrich Lecomte. Now, Lecomte himself had died, but I wanted to find out, was he a manuscript collector? Maybe he did own a lot of papyri and maybe, he did give it to Walter Fritz. Okay, great. He studied Egyptology. That doesn't tell us much, except that he was interested in the subject. And so when I tracked down colleagues and family of Hans Ulrich Lecomte, they're like, this guy, he was a tool maker. He was a tool and die maker who had an 8th grade education. The guy didn't collect anything. I mean, he sort of collected beer mugs. He liked drinking at his local pub, but he had no interest in academia. He had no interest in ancient manuscripts. He was not a collector. So then I learned that whoever told Karen King that Hans Wilhelm Comte that sold this papyrus to him was also lying. And that won't be too much of a spoiler to say that individual again was Walter Fritz. And so it became clear that Walter Fritz had lied not only to Karen King, but also to me in our initial interview, and that he had this really fascinating past where he had, grown up the son of a single mother in a very conservative Catholic town in southern Germany, a town where if you were a single mother with children, you would be basically slandered as a whore. You weren't allowed to be divorced with kids in a small Catholic town. It was seen as sinful. He was also an individual who claimed to have been abused by a Catholic priest when he was 9 years old. Again, so I'm like learning all these things that sort of would present kind of a motivation to want to embarrass the Catholic Church and to raise questions about the solidity of the story of Jesus' celibacy, and to kind of sort of stick a point of finger at the Catholic Church's own contradictions and hypocrisy in some ways. And so I was beginning to get a portrait of a man who could write, not well, in the language of Coptic, who had various kinds of motivations for potentially forging the gospel of Jesus' wife. Now, I should, in the name of fairness, say that Walter Fritz denies forging the gospel of Jesus' wife. However, I think most scholars will say with a high degree of certainty that that's not the case. And one of the things that I discovered as well was that through public records requests in Florida, was that Walter Fritz had submitted a forged master's degree in Egyptology to the Sarasota County schools. This was straight from the Florida public records request. They didn't know it was forged. I asked for all of his employment records. This thing comes back, this master's degree in Egyptology. Walter Fritz never graduated from the university with an Egyptology degree. So he either is a forger or works very closely with them. That's indisputable. And so he winds up being this really complex figure who is married to a very interesting woman. We haven't gotten into this too much yet, but his wife is, well, first of all, she wrote a book in which she claims to channel, it's a self-published book, no longer available, but published originally on Amazon, in which she claims to channel directly the voice of God, and in which she claims to make certain revelations that she believes were delivered to her through a kind of a clear channel from the Archangel Michael and God. And I think the book is titled something like Universal Truths, Volume 1. So she's this sort of spiritual medium along the lines of a kind of a Mary Magdalene. But the Mary Magdalene pictures are even more interesting sort of as a parallel, because not only is she this channeler of the voice of God, but she actually is a porn star. And this was another guess about one of those rabbit holes that you fall through. This one just was completely shocking and surprising. Did not see this coming. But after doing a bunch of more investigative reporting on the websites that Walter Fritz had registered, I found a number of porn sites. All of them had been taken down right around the time that the Gospel of Jesus' wife started getting a lot of scrutiny. But in these porn sites, they basically are surrounded, they center the figure of the wife. So it's a genre of porn known as hot wife porn, in which husbands are sort of deemed incapable of satisfying their wives. And so their wives engage in relations with other men while their husband, in this case, Walter Fritz, films. And so there's this kind of deification of the wife figure in this fetish genre of porn. And so not only is she like the number 5 like hot wife porn actress in the world at one point, but she's also channeling the voice of God. And so in their personal lives, there's this like actually absolutely fascinating, very human, I think in a way, intertwining of the themes of sexuality and religion that wind up actually finding expression in a sort of with brilliant economy in these 8 broken lines of Coptic on the Gospel of Jesus' wife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this will probably be the only story I ever fact check where I both have to email with the Vatican and watch porn. So that was definitely one of the crazy rabbit holes. And I think, you mentioned the websites. There was a finding that, because a lot of the things that you came across were, suggestive that Walter Fritz was, involved and had forged the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And one thing that I remember was really particularly compelling was that you had found he had registered gospelofjesuswife.com like right before the announcement. Is that right?
Yeah, that was another earlier breakthrough. You know, after he had been denying that he had anything to do with this, I started doing these what are called reverse Whois searches, which is a way to use a person's name, phone number, email address to figure out what web domains they've registered. And so when I did that, one of the things one of the websites that came up, yes, there were the porn websites eventually, but one of the earlier ones that came up was www.gospelofjesuswife.com. And when I looked at when he had registered the website, it was 3 weeks before Karen King's announcement in Rome. And no one, only a very, very small group of people knew about the Gospel of Jesus' Wife at that point. So I knew that Walter Fritz had to have been involved in some way in the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And then again, it was another piece of evidence that he had lied to me about his involvement in owning the papyrus.
So when your Atlantic article came out, you presented sort of your findings to the public. What pushed you to want to go on and write a full book about this and to continue following the story? And what did you find while reporting the book?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, like, as a journalist, you always, like, you know, sometimes you get to the end of the story, you're like, you realize you've reported everything there is to report, and there's really nothing more to say, and you'll just be sort of spinning your wheels. Because of the number of like trapdoors I fell through while reporting, and I felt like there was a lot more to say. Like I didn't think that I had come to the end, that I completely solved the mystery yet, and that there was more to discover. Particularly, you know, the Atlantic piece is really focused on Walter Fritz, but what the individual who's also extremely fascinating, extremely brilliant, is Karen King herself. I wanted to understand her a little bit better. I wanted to really like wade into her scholarship, understand what motivated her as a human being. You know, I wanted to portray her in a compassionate light, even if you didn't completely agree with what kind of the corner cutting she did to launch this forgery into the world and to not properly vet it. Like, what was at stake for her, and why at a time, you know, in her own life when she was basically had reached the summit, had reached the pinnacle of her career at Harvard, you know, one of the most prestigious posts in the world, why does she gamble everything on a papyrus that even she knows and believes initially is a fake? And what's at stake? And clearly, you know, there's a lot of sexism in the world of biblical studies. She's a pioneering feminist scholar who had to deal with a lot of nonsense to get to where she was. And that sexism and misogyny is also present in of course, many of the books of the Bible, which are very patriarchal, and which, you know, Paul is not, you know, Apostle Paul said some not so great things about whether women can teach a man or can speak in church. And so she's really fighting against this structural misogyny, not only in the Bible itself, but in the world of biblical study. So I really wanted to portray her as a three-dimensional figure, and I want to do the reporting that would do that justice. I also wanted to know how a place as distinguished as Harvard, and a scholar as distinguished as Karen King, and a journal as distinguished as the Harvard Theological Review could allow essentially a really bad forgery to pass through its gates. Like, how did that breakdown happen? What are the series of things that have to go wrong? And there were a whole other series of discoveries that will take us all the way up to the office of the Harvard president that I made in the course of reporting the book. So this is not a retread of the magazine article. You read the magazine article, you might get a fraction of what you get in the book, but it's really a much larger, much more sweeping story that takes you into you know, these two fascinating characters of Karen King and Walter Fritz, but also the history of these excluded gospels that tell a completely different story about early Christianity, and then the detective story of really, you know, trying to sort of solve a mystery when people are lying to you. And so there's all three of those elements that I hope people will thrill to in the book.
Yeah, I mean, the discoveries that you make about Karen King's sort of involvement with the peer review process of the article about the fragment, and especially about just sort of how her scholarship connected and in some ways played into her getting involved with the Gospel of Jesus' Wife to begin with, and putting her, you know, reputation behind it. They left my jaw on the floor. It's really incredible reporting. And it's definitely stuff that's not in the article. It really filled in those questions of why Karen King? Why was she the one who got involved and was the person who put the fragment out there? So the title, there's a lot of odds and ends to track down, and you chose the title Veritas. I wonder why that word. Like, what is it about that word that?
Sure. I mean, of course, on the most superficial level, it's the 400-year-old motto of Harvard. It's a Latin word for truth, and I think truth is sort of the central idea, central theme of the book. What are the criteria? What criteria does one use to establish the truth of something? Whether it's the authenticity of a manuscript, whether Jesus was married, whether Jesus was celibate, whether you're a historian trying to reconstruct the earliest centuries of Christianity. And I think that the different pathways to truth are really kind of a central theme of the book. I mean, as a journalist, I do believe in a discernible, verifiable reality. I go out and report, I interview people, I look at documents, I look at studies, I go and observe things firsthand to try to present to present as close of a version of the truth as possible to readers. Now, do we get it 100% right? No, of course not. We can't. But if we make mistakes, we go back and try to get it better again the next time. We're not just sort of making it up as we go along. We're not presenting our own truth. We're presenting what we believe to be the most accurate reflection of the truth based on all the data we've gathered. And I think scientists, if they're doing good science, use the same sort of positivist criteria or empiricist criteria for to establish the truth of something. And then you have the question of faith. Now remember, Harvard was founded to train ministers. Initially it was basically a seminary to train Calvinist ministers, Congregationalist ministers for the colonies. And so Veritas originally meant God's truth. It was the truth. The touchstone for truth was whether the truth came from God. And so, in sort of if you're using a standards of faith, you don't need to be able to footnote faith. You believe it because you've read it in a book that, if you're a true believer, if you're Orthodox, certainly, that you believe is the Word of God. And so you don't need to use objective empirical criteria to establish the veracity of something. And then Karen King kind of comes at it from this other really interesting approach. Now, she is a believer. She is a liberal Christian believer. But she's also a postmodernist and someone who doesn't believe that there is a discernible, verifiable reality, the one that human beings have any access to. That basically it's all a language game. We construct reality through language. And so I can have my truth and you can have your truth. Now, of course, this very much speaks to the present moment we're in politically, right? In the world of alternative facts, in the world in which settled elections are being audited because certain people refuse to believe multiple evidences of the truth of an election result. So we're at a moment in which the very idea of facts and the very idea of truth is being disputed. And I think a lot of it is at stake at that, not only for academics, but I think just for the fabric of our democracy. And so Veritas seemed like a very apt title, not only because it references what was supposed to be the highest ideal of the richest and most powerful university in the world, but it also it's a Latin word for what is really the linchpin idea of the book.
Mm-hmm. What was different about reporting the book in itself? I mean, you had written books before, but where did you begin with this, as far as knowing what to follow?
Just a ton of reading. Before I even went out and did any more interviews, I spent like a month at the Library of Congress, which happens to be my local library. I'm very fortunate that way. It's just a few blocks away from where I live here on Capitol Hill. Reading every single thing that Karen King had written, because I really wanted to not just focus on the gospel of Jesus. I needed to understand what motivated her. I needed to understand her values. I needed to understand her previous scholarship. So just did a ton of reading before I hit the road again. Before I knocked on people's doors or made cold calls. Traveled to Germany a couple more times. Traveled to other countries and states. I really wanted to do just a ton of reading, and so that's where I began. You can't credibly write about an academic unless you read every single thing they've written, not for a book, and that's where I started.
And in reading Karen King's work, I mean, was that an eye-opening experience? That wasn't something you had gone so deep into before, I guess. So
right. Yeah, just understanding her methodologies. Well, I think that was really eye-opening to understand the kind of history that she did. I mean, she once called it intellectual history in a new key, and it speaks to this like way of doing history that is. I mean, I don't want to sort of get bogged down in it, but it's a way. It's a lot of it's based on sort of the interpretation of text rather than establishing sort of what happened. And so it's a different kind of, it's kind of postmodernist approach to trying to understand the past. And seeing that, what's interesting is that Karen King self-presents when she's in front of the media. She talks about wanting to get the facts right. So in fact, she'll use scientific sounding terms like data. Like, I want to get the best data and the best data sets on the life of Jesus. But if you actually read the footnotes and her more theoretical writings, she doesn't believe in data sets or facts. In fact, she'll tell you in one place I found an unpublished article, she said that facts were little tyrants and that they can get in the way. And so there's a way in which, and this is not alone. This is a sort of theoretical school of history that she belongs to. So there's this like self-presentation of, it's just the facts. I'm going to cover the real truth as a good conventional historian using data. That's the public self-presentation. And then there's the actual academic work, which is kind of a different set of theories. And so there's sort of a misalignment, in my view. I mean, people might disagree. There's sort of a misalignment between the public presentation and the media representation and what she's actually doing as a historian.
And King, she had sort of a goal with her history. Is that right? That she had a sort of inclination to want to find certain types of stories and to present certain types of facts.
Yeah, and again, you'll find that in the footnotes. The books that she in some ways, I think she's really more of a theologian, and you know, in the sense of someone who's interpreting text in ways that she believes will make Christianity a more inclusive and more sort of fulfilling faith for people who have traditionally been excluded. I think, which is a very noble goal, and that makes it quite admirable in a way. Now, how do you make Christianity less prejudicial? You know, for everything from same-sex marriage to not feeling that sexuality is inherently sinful, to divorce, to debates over abortion or birth control, which are all about fundamentally the idea of sex for reasons other than procreation, right? That's why it troubles conservative Christians so much. And all this comes back to these very fundamental ideas. And I think what she's trying to do is say, look, there are these other texts, there's these other ways in which we can be Christians that aren't so constraining. And so I think a lot of what she's doing, there's this sort of normative element. It's like, it's not just sort of what happened. This is how we should be going forward. And so there is this, like, there's this project, there's a theological project that's also a part of her scholarship that was also really interesting to learn about when I was reading more of her work.
And there's an audience question, which I wanted to touch on as well, which is, you know, King, I don't think really after your Smithsonian article was very interested in participating in your reporting, but did you ever get a sense of when she knew it was a scam, as the question says, or when she kind of understood that the fragment was not authentic as she had presented?
I mean, one of the things I discovered is that when she first got it, as soon as she first looked at it, she thought it was a modern fake. Mm-hmm. And she said, you know, she said as much. I looked at it. This is too good to be true. No way. It's too Da Vinci Code. And she actually put it aside. She blew this guy off. She said, no, thank you. In fact, she emailed him. She said, sorry, I tried to translate. I didn't really get anywhere. Maybe another scholar can help you. She blows him off. The Walter Fritz writes her back and says, you know, I know this is challenging. I struggle with this thing too. Is there any way you could look at it again? It's like this Hail, I mean, not this really bad pun, but it's a Hail Mary pass. Walter Fritz is like, you know, I understand how difficult this is. Is there any way you could give it a little bit more of your time? Zero response. She basically ghosts him. Like, I mean, the response is, no thanks, pal. You're not going to fool me. Then, well, I don't want to give away the spoiler here, but 4 months later, Karen King does this 180, and she writes in this very effusive email saying, I'd like to publish her Papyrus. And you have to get to the end of the book to figure out what I believe was a factor in changing her mind. But so she will tell you, she has said as much, that she thought it was a fake from the very start. So the question of whether, one of the things about Karen King that's interesting is that during the Da Vinci Code craze, in like the mid-aughts, this sold 80 million copies, huge international cultural phenomenon. She was one of the go-to scholars that journalists would call to sort of hear about the true sort of alternative, the story of Mary Magdalene that you don't normally hear about, which is attested in these other texts like the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary. And she was one of the most prominent scholars, or most frequently consulted scholars when reporters wanted interviews. One of the interesting things, though, about Karen King's interviews about the Da Vinci Code was that she wasn't particularly troubled that the Da Vinci Code was a work of fiction. She notably was untroubled that it was a work of fiction. So you had other scholars, like prominent scholars at Chicago and Yale, saying, this is, there's little bits and pieces of truthiness or like little facts, but they're completely distorted and misrepresented. Do not read the Da Vinci Code as history. It's a great, if you like this kind of book, it's a really great thriller. It's not history. It's just this. You should not read it for history. Karen King was not troubled by that. She said, if this book, despite its being fiction, gets people to ask important questions about early Christianity, then that's okay. It doesn't matter that it's fake, that it's fiction, because if it gets people to question Christianity, it's doing a good thing. It's sort of an ends justify the means approach. So one of the questions I raised at the end of the book is whether the Gospel of Jesus' wife functions in the same way. If she was willing to tolerate one work of fiction in the service of a greater truth, might she also be willing to tolerate the Gospel of Jesus' wife as a forgery, or a forgery she's not really sure whether it's a forgery, in order to get the public to ask really important questions about the official story of Christianity? And I think that's a question the book asks at the end, and sort of leave to readers to decide where they come down. But I think there's an argument to be made that she was willing to tolerate a high degree of uncertainty about this fragment, which again, she calls the Gospel of Jesus' wife. There's nothing, that title doesn't appear anywhere in the fragment itself. It's a title that is made for the headlines and attracted the very sorts of headlines she anticipated they would attract. And so I think that's one of the questions that the book leaves readers with, is what was she willing to tolerate a fake if it was in the service of a larger truth?
I don't know if we have time for one more. I just wanted to see you very quickly tell those listening where the Gospel of Jesus' wife is today, because after you published the book, some interesting twists continued to happen. So.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things is, because this is one of the things, like once a falsehood is unleashed into the world, it's very hard to correct. But so the country of Egypt is very, very has entire Ministry of Antiquities that is very interested in anything that might be sort of Egyptian that turns up anywhere in the world. And they will often ask questions about it, because if it's been looted or if it's been taken away from Egypt, they want to get it back, or they want to look at it. And a lot of authentic things have been looted from Egypt. So apparently someone in the Ministry of Antiquities in Egypt saw the 8-year-old Smithsonian Channel documentary, which had not been updated. So it was filmed actually before Karen King even announced in Rome. So the documentary presents this discovery as an authentic piece, very likely authentic piece. And so someone saw this documentary online in the Ministry of Antiquities and said, "Oh, if this is not Egyptian fragment, we would like to take a look at it." So they wrote to the Americans and said, "We believe we'd like to take a look at this. We'd like all the information you have on this papyrus. We have no idea whether it's fake or authentic or not, but if it's in Coptic, we're interested." And so in late 2019, the Department of Homeland Security sent 2 agents to the Harvard Library to seize the Gospel of Jesus' wife, because Egypt was curious about it. And so and this was actually, most collectors, if Egypt comes looking for something, are like, "Wait a second, no, I acquired this legally. This is mine. Don't worry about it." Walter Fritz, according to my sources, was thrilled, because now this thing got another lease on life. Egypt was wondering whether this might be their papyrus. Now Egypt, of course, I interviewed the Ministry of one of the top officials of their antiquities ministry, said, "I don't know if this is real or fake. We have no idea, but if we want, we're interested in learning what we can about it." And so Walter Fritz was actually quite happy at the prospect of Egypt kind of like taking the papyrus, taking it away from him, and then sort of giving it another sort of varnish of maybe this is authentic again. Now, to this day, Egypt has not made a request to repatriate the papyrus. To the best of my knowledge, and I'm continuing to follow this, the papyrus remains in the Department of Homeland Security custody, and DHS continues to investigate possibly other things associated with it. But it just when I say that this is a story that continues to surprise and deliver sort of one trapdoor after another, this is just another piece of evidence of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to imagine an Indiana Jones style ending where the papyrus is put into some vast warehouse by the government.
I mean, it's precisely what that evokes, is that last scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where some functionary is wheeling it into a warehouse where it'll probably never be heard from again. So it, yeah, very, very apt. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both so much, William and Ariel. That was quite a fascinating sequence of events that you just enlightened us about. And thank you to our audience as well for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you. I just sent into the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen, 3 links. The first is the link to the Village Books website, where you can find Veritas and purchase it if you'd like. The second is the link to the Village Books YouTube channel, where you can view past events. This particular event will only be available until October 6th. So be sure to watch it if you're planning to rewatch it, or if you have friends, family that you think would be interested, be sure to give it to them before October 6th. And finally, the article, Ariel's article, The Unbelievable Tale of Jesus' Wife, Just for Fun, is the last link there. All right. And do you have any final words, William or Ariel?
No, just want to thank everybody for turning out. I really appreciate it. I had a chance to visit Bellingham for my first book, maybe about 11 years ago, and really enjoyed it. So it's a thrill to sort of be back virtually, at least. And thank you to Charlie and Billy again for hosting and being such a great interviewer.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks to Charlie for helping us get it together, and thanks for everyone who came along to listen.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely night.